Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining today. My name is Ellen Galdava. I'm Program Officer at Mobile Solutions Technical Assistance and Research MSTAR program under USAID Cooperative Agreement. I'm pleased to see all of you attending our Monday morning webinar on farmer profiles. We will try to make this webinar exciting and engaging to make sure that your week starts with full of fresh ideas and information. Well, we will try to do so at least. Just to provide a brief background about the work that we did, in fall of 2017, Global Development Labs, Digital Development Feed the Future, and MSTAR decided to conduct a complete landscape on how farmer profiles are defined, conceptualized, and employed. Our goal was to provide a comprehensive scan on what farmer profiles is in both in supporting of existing and new business models, how it impacts agriculture and food security programming through the lens of big data analytics, and lastly, to provide clarity on varying interpretation of the term itself. For that reason, we contracted Grameen Foundation, who undertook on this challenging but very interesting mission to conduct this research and develop a report named Data-Driven Agriculture, the Future of Smallholder Farmer Data Management and Use. The full report and an infographic will be published soon, and we will make sure that all of you receive a copy of those. And I said that we already have one question regarding the recording of this webinar. We will definitely share it with the attendees of the webinar, and it will be accessible for the public. So today's agenda is following. I will give an opportunity to President Kaur, Senior Policy Advisor at USAID, to talk about the importance of farmers' profile. After Kwesi's quick speech, we will turn to Bobby Gray from Grameen Foundation, who will walk us through the report and her findings. And with this, I want to invite Kwesi to unmute his mic and talk about digital farmer profiles.
And let me start by thanking you, Ellen, for the introduction, and to you all for joining us today. And greetings from Washington, D.C. My name is Kwesi Donko, and I work in the Global Development Lab here in Washington. And again, I know that I have, based on these technical difficulties, I don't want to waste too much time, but I just want to say a couple of things, and what I want to do is to help contextualize USAID's interest in supporting what we view as a public good research piece, which we think has been well done by Bobby and the rest of the Grameen Foundation team. First off, this was born out of a collaboration between the U.S. Global Development Lab and the Bureau for Food Security in an effort called the Digital Development for Feed the Future. And the idea here was to demonstrate how digital tools can accelerate progress towards the Feed the Future high-level indicators of increasing agricultural income and improving nutrition in the 19 priority countries. We didn't do all of them, but we picked a number of those countries to work in, and this is one of the projects that came from that. The second thing that I'd like to say is that, you know, the spread of mobile technology combined with remote sensing data and distributed computing and storage capabilities are opening up new opportunities to integrate smallholder farm households into the broader agri-food system. We believe, and it can be argued, that this change begins with one basic activity, and this is also part of this conversation that we want to have, which is to compile farmer profiles. So what is the idea that, you know, how are these farm profiles compiled? How are they stored? How are they analyzed, utilized to advance digital technologies and to drive positive development outcomes for rural populations? Lastly, you know, we hope that this is just the start of the conversation, and we hope that your questions will help drive the learning forward. That said, we did not expect this to be necessarily an exhaustive study, but we wanted to at least answer 3 questions that we had wrestled with. We wanted this work to provide a comprehensive scan on what farmer profiles as an opportunity is, both in support of existing and new businesses, business models, that is. We also wanted to understand its impact on agriculture and food security programming through the lens of big data analytics. And finally, we were looking for clarity on the varying interpretations of farmer profile, the term itself. This is something that we also struggled with. And we think that this is part of the conversation that we've started, and we hope that you would find this very useful. And with that, I'll pause and hand it over to Bobby to get us started. Thank you again.
Great, thanks, Kwesi. Can everybody hear me? Ellen, can you just make sure you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lisa. So thank you again, and welcome everybody to the webinar this morning. Again, this is Bobby Gray, and I'm Research Director at Grameen Foundation. And I just want to thank Kwesi and Ellen both for the introduction. And I'd also like to thank my Grameen colleagues who help support this research as I'm representing our collective work this morning. So we've got quite a bit of ground to cover. So during this presentation, if at any point you have a question or a comment, I invite you to put that into the chat box, and Ellen and the team will be monitoring those throughout the presentation, and I'll aim to engage everyone in conversation at the end of the presentation. But I'm going to go ahead and just jump into the presentation. First of all, I just want to set the ground for what we're going to be covering. And I think Kwesi did a great job of giving the broad overview of what we're going to cover today. But we start out with the acknowledgement that there's an estimate that there's more than 500 million smallholder farmers worldwide that make a significant contribution to food production and the genetic diversity of the food supply. But this population is quite diverse. They live in different contexts, they have different needs and different profiles. So how do we gather information to understand who they are, and how do we use this data to meet their needs and effectively support them? In the past, the way that we've developed an understanding of farmers has really been through a tight interaction by very few actors, namely the farmer, who provides data to an extension agent, who collects this on behalf of a service provider in exchange for the farmer receiving information and services. But with the advances in technology, there's an unprecedented opportunity to gain more timely and deeper insights into farmer needs. So there's the new technology facilitates the ability to gather information from multiple sources, not just the farmer and not just the extension agent or service provider. So for example, data can be gathered from satellite or sensors or drones. Data can be gathered from multiple service providers, and this data can be used simultaneously by multiple service providers, such as a local NGO or farmer support service, a financial service provider, agro input dealers, and agribusinesses. So the time really seems ripe to stop and take stock of what we understand of the development and use of farmer profile data, but really think about the future and where we can go with the data on smallholder farmers. So as Kwesi had indicated early on, the goals of this assessment were really to document experiences of managing smallholder farmer data, highlight innovative models of data management, and outline key considerations for the development of smallholder farmer digital profiles. So over about a 3-month period, we conducted a desk review, and this consisted of anything from webinars, blogs, program papers, research, documentation, etc. And we conducted over 50 key informant interviews, and this really represents over 50 organizations that we spoke to, and these ranged from your mobile network operators, agribusinesses, technical assistance providers, researchers, government, et cetera. And as Kwesi had indicated, this wasn't really meant to be exhaustive, but representative. And there are many organizations, I'm sure, that will relate to some of what we're sharing today. And we invite the addition of any other experiences to this process. So we're going to start out by talking about who is a smallholder farmer, then we'll go to who collects data on them, what type of data is collected, how is data captured, stored, analyzed, what is the role of qualitative data within this conversation, how is data shared, used, and then what is innovation in smallholder profile data management. So first of all, who is a smallholder farmer? And we started out with this question so that we knew where we were targeting this conversation. And first of all, the main conclusion that comes from this question is that defining a smallholder farmer is actually not a very simple task. Even when we service providers generally use the size of land holding as defining who smallholder farmers are, or specific thresholds. So for example, a maximum amount of livestock or asset holdings, for example. But really where there's the biggest diversity is how we identify and target smallholder farmer households. So the first one that comes out is just the self-identity as a farmer. And this is important because there are people who self-identify as a farmer but may not actually earn the majority of their income from agriculture. The type of crop grown is one way that they get targeted. Membership in organized farmer groups, cooperatives, and associations. So I think these two, the crop grown and the memberships, are really where lots of farmers get targeted, because it's easier to find them and to support them, especially if they're in groups. Some of the newer definitions or ways that we identify and target smallholder farmers is the last three. So profit potential is a definition that comes from IFPRI, where the team there are actually proposing that we should spend less time talking about the size of land holding, for example, and more time differentiating between those who have profit potential and those who don't. So for example, those who don't have profit potential are those who face more hard constraints. So for example, they may just own pieces of land that are never going to be really productive, whereas soft constraints may be the lack of credit or financing or the lack of knowledge. And so they propose this as an alternative definition for considering how we identify smallholder farmers. Also, the concept of plot manager is being used more and more now. And this is really with the aim of differentiating between the roles that people have in the household on the farm. So one farm can have multiple plots, and different people within the farming household can manage those plots. And I think this aims to be more inclusive of women in particular, because of the fact she may manage a small plot and be kind of left out, especially if we're talking about farmer groups where there may be more men who are members of those groups. And then finally, one that we're calling a predictive digital identification, and this really came more from conversations with the MNOs who were able to use cell phone data to identify who may be their target client, for example. And so one example came from the GSMA team when they were working with an MNO in Sri Lanka, where they were able to use the mobile phone usage data to actually identify women, for example. So one of the things that we learned, through this is that even though different people may have a phone, like one man may be able to purchase 5 phones and they could all be registered under his name, but he may give them out to the women in his household. And so you actually don't have registration data on that phone for the actual users of that data. So the MNO in Sri Lanka use this data to actually, for example, define that if the phone didn't move during certain times of the day, they could determine that that was probably a woman or a housewife, and they were able to target content to her around gardening because they figured she may be the most interested in that content. So I think this is just a new way of targeting different types of households. But one of the things that came out of this conversation was the importance that really when aggregating data, and we'll get into this a little bit later, it's actually the farm itself that pulls data together. So back to this point about plot manager in particular, is that one farm could have multiple plots and different people managing that. So the complication of trying to pinpoint one particular person that this relates to is really difficult. And it's really the farm that pulls the different people related to that plot together, as well as like the plant science. And we'll get into this a little bit later. So who collects data on smallholder farmers? So there are 4 main service provider models. There are researchers, government or NGO extension, technical assistance providers, and commercial service providers that include both business to business and business to consumer. So researchers could be anything from your CGAPs, your CGIARs, your insight to impact organizations, your government and NGO extension are your government programs and your NGO programs that have been in existence for a really long time supporting farmers. Your technical assistance providers would be those like Grameen, Mercy Corps, et cetera, and your commercial. So your business to business could be your satellite or sensor companies like Aware or Flybird Innovations, and business to consumer like your MNOs and recalls. And we'll get into some of these examples later. But what's important about these service providers is really that they're just an important starting point for understanding incentives, like how they may use data. And really what I think differentiates them in terms of data usage is actually the amount of time they are able to use the data. So I think your researchers and technical assistance providers, for example, have a shorter time period for which they can use data, whereas government and commercial entities tend to be in existence in one place for a longer period of time. But one thing that's changing with the expansion and the use of mobile technology is really that farmers can gain real-time benefits from interacting with their own data. So whereas in the past, where, in the model that I showed earlier, the service providers may be the ones actually using that data, now farmers can actually, as they provide their data, can get immediate benefit from it. So I'm going to give 3 examples of what this looks like. So there's an initiative called Mngmt Master, where they are using like game simulations to enable farmers to experiment and learn about recommendations on fertilizer inputs needed for their particular soil type. So the farmer will provide their basic data, and this data gets combined with rainfall data, soil information, crop modeling, and this allows the farmer to play around with different decisions through the use of an application. Another type of innovation in this space are the digital services from the FAO. So they have a series of 4 farmer applications that the farmer can either download on their own phone or that can be used through an extension agent, depending on the penetration of mobile phones in the area. And so 2 countries where they're pilot testing 4 different apps are in, I believe, Rwanda and Senegal. And so the 4 apps are like a livestock app where they provide real-time information on animal disease control and feeding strategies, a weather and crop calendar, which combines weather forecast information and crop calendars and alert systems, an agri-marketplace app that connects producers and traders and consumers to facilitate trade and access to inputs, and then one called eNutriFood, which provides information on production, conservation, and consumption of nutritious foods. And then finally, one other is from a company called Akorian out of Uganda. They have an Easy Agric app, and this is an app that the farmer can put on their phone, and they enter their own profile data and their plot and garden information. They can order soil testing from their phone, watch videos on different practices. So there's a much tighter relationship between the data that the farmer is providing and the immediate benefit that they're getting from that. So what type of data is collected? So one of the things in the interviews that we did was actually ask everyone, what actual data points are they collecting on farmers? And we also ran across a resource that the Center for Agricultural and Rural Cooperation, or CTA, actually published in November of 2017, where they had looked across their own network and asked these exact same questions. And we felt that this was a really nice resource because they had pretty much done the same activity that we had done and already kind of defined the different types of data types that most indicators fall under. So for example, the different types of categories of data were personal information, communication, location, farm details, field information, crop, production information, your financial instruments, the different types of qualifications or certifications that a farmer has, in business information. And so I'm not going to go so much into what are all the indicators here because I invite you to actually review that study. And we do go into this more in depth in the paper, but I think what's important to articulate at this stage is that new data technologies are already changing and will continue to change how some of this data actually gets collected or the types of data points that we'll actually have. So for example, under personal information, which is typically your know your client or KYC information, like name and age, identity numbers, et cetera, The satellite data is now being used to predict poverty, for example. So instead of asking poverty questions, or you can actually use satellite to predict poverty levels. Blockchain is going to change the way farmers are able to allow others to use their data, as well as just mobile phone and social media data. So anytime any one of us sign into new applications and it asks you, do you want to use your Google or Facebook information to fill out the profile for this service? We see some of that changing. And really, you'll see satellite and GPS obviously throughout the way a lot of these are going to be changed, as well as like application programming interfaces that allow different databases to talk to each other. So connecting land ownership or registry information, actually pulling that from the database where that exists. And I think also what changes in the collection of some of this data is actually the ability to track transactions. And so in the past, where we may have just asked questions such as, do you have credit? Where do you have credit from? What's your current loan size, for example? The technology is actually going to allow the tracking of actual transactions, as well as the development of alternative credit scores. And we'll get into some of this a little bit later as well. But I invite you to review the CTA report because I thought it was well done. And really, we found that most of the data that we captured from a lot of our key informants fell into these exact same categories. But overall, there seems to be a general agreement that comprehensive farmer profiles are needed to give precise support to farmers, but it's really the new ways of collecting and aggregating data, applying analytics that can reduce the amount of direct input that's needed from the farmer, and will therefore reduce some of the data collection fatigue when there are multiple organizations that are targeting the same farmer for information. And one last point that I want to draw out on the type of data that's being collected is that gender remains a challenge generally for agriculture, but it also remains a challenge because the sector lacks good data on women. And so in a lot of our interviews where we touched on this, it really didn't come out very strongly, but there's a lot of research being done right now to try to both collect better data on both men and women so that there's less of a gender gap in what we understand about smallholder farmers. So how is data captured? So as Kwesi had mentioned earlier, digital data collection is the starting point for a lot of what we're going to talk about going forward. And while some of the organizations we talked to were still using paper surveys, some organizations are actually using a hybrid where they may still be using paper and as well as some digital, but we really tried to focus on interviewing organizations that use digital data capture in some way. So there are three main data capture models that we're going to talk about here. The first one is people facilitated. The second one is from the farmer's mobile phone, and then remote sensing or data capture. So people facilitated is probably what most people can imagine is a traditional way of collecting data where there's an extension agent, a researcher, somebody representing a service provider that comes out and collects data from the farmer. This can be done in paper surveys, digital surveys, and this also captures human-centered design, more of your qualitative kind of market research that happens at the beginning of a project. In the center, we have the farmer's mobile phone. There's three different ways data gets captured from a mobile phone. The first one is just phone-based capture, and this is more of a direct interaction between the farmer and the service provider, and really from an MNO for the most part, where an MNO can send SMS messages. They can collect data from the farmer using SMS messages. So for example, a service provider could send out a message to ask for verification that there is a pest actually present, and the farmers can verify that. Outbound dialing is another method where you can schedule phone calls to call out to farmers so that you can collect data at particular times that's convenient for them. And you can use SMS or IVR or a call center to actually capture the data from those calls. IVR is obviously another way where you can have planned ways for capturing data from farmers, and then call centers, which I think pretty much speak for themselves. There's also passive mobile data capture. So this is where the phone is able to capture GPS points, actual phone usage like data usage, and then transactions, like if you're using mobile money, et cetera. And then finally, your mobile phone applications, where there's an app on the phone, and when people put the app on the phone, they're able to register farmers, collect that profile data there. They can capture usage from that application. And then chatbots and crowdsourcing are two methods also that are able to capture data. And we'll talk about one of a chatbot example later. And then crowdsourcing, where again, it's almost like what I was talking about before, where they're able to validate either in things that are happening in the field through crowdsourcing information from farmers. And then finally, your remote sensing or capture, which captures your sensors, satellite, drones, and weather data, as well as your APIs, where you're able to get different data sources to talk to each other, where you can capture national ID information, land management, pulling data from Facebook, phone data, and other data sets. So all of this goes into a database, and really going forward, future farmer profiles would really do well to leverage all three of these methods or data capture in some way. And this is occurring across some of the examples that we'll share today. So how is data stored? So we're going to talk a little bit about cloud-based storage and blockchain here, where we found that while cloud-based storage is not necessary, because some organizations have servers and large enough computing power in-house, cloud-based storage is actually what helps blockchain and digital wallets and lending platforms and the Internet of Things actually work, because it actually facilitates data integration and analytics with other data sources that are already on the cloud. So some examples of cloud-based storage are Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, Google, Alibaba, IBM, Oracle, and Salesforce. So one example that some of you may have heard of is the use of TerraWorks, where multiple service providers can actually access data and manage it together. And we'll go into some examples of this later. Blockchain, most recently, in those who are in the blockchain space, are actually talking more about the fact that blockchain itself may underpin cloud storage into the future. And so if you could imagine a bunch of computers around the world that have unused storage space on their computers, and you could actually monetize that space, this is something that's currently being discussed as a potential for the future. But blockchain by itself also promises to facilitate digital identity, capture, mobile money transactions, and one hope is that it will actually allow farmers to potentially monetize their own data, that they can control their own data, and it holds promise for reducing corruption. I think this is a big question mark, because even in conversations going on around whether we own our own data, even in health or other aspects of our life, it'll be something to just watch for. So how is data analyzed? So Krista Norden from Insight to Impact had actually put together a really nice paper on basically just on data analytics, I think for the financial services sector. And we found it to be a really helpful resource. So we chose to kind of stick to the structure that she had presented in her paper, but make it to tailor it to more agriculture. So there are 5 different types of analytics. There's descriptive, diagnostic, predictive, prescriptive, and cognitive. So the first 2, descriptive and diagnostic, look to the past, and they try to answer questions like what happened, when and where. And diagnostic tries to answer why did it happen. So descriptive analytics look a lot like what most people have probably seen before. Your typical research papers that are looking at averages for different responses. So like with the CGAP, Smallholder Farmer Diaries, the different types of information that came out on all of the farmers would be basic descriptive analytics. And then diagnostic analytics, asking the question, why did it happen, would be when you drill down into that data a little bit more. So like your random forest algorithms fall into this category, where it helps segment or classify data, regression, statistics, et cetera, fall into this. And so diagnostic analytics tend to look like dashboards of information when they get created in certain applications, where they're trying to drill down into comparing men versus women, or land size, or et cetera. So predictive, prescriptive, and cognitive look to the future. So they use information to be able to predict what's going to happen. So predictive looks at what's likely to happen. Prescriptive takes predictive analytics one step further with what should be done, what sort of recommendation should be provided. And cognitive goes one step further into what is the best action. So I will have to admit that when we were trying to differentiate between cognitive and the predictive and prescriptive, this got a little bit fuzzy. And so I think there's some debate as to whether cognitive is really that different, and it's more of getting the algorithms and things like that getting much more sophisticated, and that machine learning and getting better at prediction, et cetera, over time. So I'm going to give some examples of the last three because I think they are the newer types of analytics that people may not be as may not have as much awareness on. So the first one, for a predictive analytics example, I want to use a case study on Mngmt, Colombia. So Mngmt is a cross-sectoral partnership with the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, or CIOT, the Colombian Ministry of Ag and Rural Development, or MARD, the National Institute of Hydrology, Meteorology, and Environmental Studies, and FEDEARROS, which is the Association of Rice Growers in Colombia. And CIOT took all of the data from FEDEARROS's 25 years of collecting rice surveys, and they're monitoring harvest results over time, and plant science data that they had been collecting with the National Institute of Hydrology. They took their station level weather data that is germane to determining rice growth. And they pulled all of this data together and were able to predict that a major dry period was going to disrupt the upcoming growing season. So with this data, they turned around and told farmers that really the best action they needed to take was to delay planting. And those farmers who delayed planting, while everyone did experience the the negative consequences of the drought, the farmers who delayed planting had fewer losses. And one study found that these recommendations led to an estimated savings of $3.6 million of potential economic losses. So two examples of prescriptive analytics are from the Mngmt master example I gave earlier, where through the combining the farmer data with the crop modeling, soil testing, et cetera, they're able to play through different types of recommendations that the app will give them so that they can take risk without actually facing the consequences of any of the decisions that they make. Another one is from the market-led user-owned ICT for Ag-enabled information service. I'm going to pronounce this as Muis, and I'm not exactly sure if the team would pronounce it this way, but so Muis uses satellite-based information services for weather forecasting and alerts, crop management, agronomic tips, and financial services, and includes index-based insurance for farmers' crops in Uganda. And so when different conditions come together with all of the weather and the satellite and all of these different pieces, and the system is able to automatically send out alerts to the farmers as to what they should be, what sort of step they should take. Within the cognitive analytics space, so there are two examples here that I'd like to share. The first one is from a company called Farm.inc, and they actually use social media data like Facebook profile data from these different farming groups in Kenya, and they use natural language processing to direct content to farmers in those groups, as well as they leverage a chatbot technology so when farmers type in different questions that they may have on their animals, et cetera, they are able to provide feedback back to them. And then Recult is a company that has operations in Thailand and Pakistan, and they have their own proprietary credit worthiness assessment that links farmers with affordable credit, high quality inputs, extension services, and visibility to buyers. And so I want to share, just because I think there's a lot of work going on with different types of alternative credit scoring, et cetera. I just wanted to share Recult's credit worthiness kind of framework that they use, and they use cognitive analytics to help get better at predicting whether a farmer is credit worthy. So they actually pull data on soil fertility, and they actually use satellite for the soil fertility piece of it. And depending on the conditions of the soil and what they know about the profit potential within that area, they estimate expected crop revenue. They pull in reputational profiling, where they'll get different people from a community to answer a few questions about the likelihood of this person being credit worthy, and then pulling in social collateral data like group guarantees and information. So all of this data gets used to help them predict whether a person is credit worthy or not. And here's also a graphic of their model overall, which I think is just interesting, because they're one of these business to consumer providers, as well as kind of a B2B, depending on the way that you look at it, where they're kind of addressing the farmer's full ecosystem. So as you can see in the graphic, they collect information early on the farmer. They use this satellite imagery, weather data, this social collateral, and the reputational profiling to determine whether they access credit. This also provides a list of inputs that the farmer should have based on some of the information that they've collected from the farmer. Once they determine what the inputs are, Recall actually delivers those inputs directly. So they don't actually provide the credit directly to the farmer, but they provide it in the form of the inputs that they will need to be productive. And so Recall and their team will actually deliver those inputs. And then when you get into the growing and harvest period, they're able to send information to the farmer based on satellite and weather. Is it going to rain? Planting recommendations, etc. And then they help arrange where the farmer is going to sell their crops. So they have different partnerships with agribusinesses that will purchase those crops at the end of the harvest. Okay, so now we're going to switch quickly just to explore the question of what is the role of qualitative data. So what I found interesting about this, and really what I want to come out in this presentation, is just an opportunity that we saw when we early on started looking at all of the human-centered design research that was out there, in this kind of growing use of farmer archetypes or client archetypes, where you do the human-centered design up front, and you categorize the different types of farmers that you're likely going to encounter. And this helps design products and services once you understand kind of the incentives and needs that different types of farmers have. And one thing that we felt that these archetypes are really interesting, and they help kind of create empathy and help people relate to the people that they're going to serve. But once you get past this human-centered design phase, you actually don't see this data getting used to help service providers think about the motivations that farmers may have, and they don't kind of go back and validate that within their population there are these different types of people, and they maybe need to be served in different ways. So within a lot of the literature around human-centered design, within kind of the big data analytics world right now, they've started calling this thick data. It's kind of the mirror of big data. And really some of the debate on thick data versus big data looks a lot like the quantitative versus qualitative debate that's been going on forever. But I think what's important here is really just the recognition that there's an opportunity for a tighter collaboration between the human-centered design phase and the implementing and monitoring and evaluation data that's coming in once the analytics are there. Because I think, there's just a concern that with big data, we'll lose the empathy that we need for the people that are within that population. So how is data shared? So there's two things we're going to talk about here. The first one is private data sharing, and then the next one is open data. So private data sharing platforms are leveraging that cloud-based system that we talked about earlier in terms of data storage. And these private data sharing platforms make it possible for more than one service provider to access real-time data. So one of the examples I want to give here is of how Grameen and the TerraWorks team have been using the TerraWorks product that has Salesforce in the background to facilitate this data sharing with multiple partners. So for example, there's a partner in Colombia called Andes, where all of the data that's being collected on the farmers from their cooperative is actually being used to develop one of these alternative risk scores, which we call a RET for short. It also helps facilitate an M-sourcing product where grocery stores are able to link up with producers of vegetables and fruit and actually source that data directly. So they communicate with the cooperatives to indicate how much of something that they need in their grocery store, and the cooperative is able to pull this together and make the sell. And then 2 other projects, Agrotech in Ghana, which worked with the Advanced 2 project in Ghana, a USAID project, and then FarmerLink. And I'll go into the FarmerLink a little bit more later. So what's important about these is that multiple service providers can look at the same data. They may just have it look different. So you may have different dashboards of data that's applicable to those organizations. So like I said, FarmerLink will be an example. I'll kind of go into this a little bit more later. And then open data is freely available to anyone to use, analyze, and develop learning products. And it's facilitating innovative creation of new data and generating insights. And I'm going to go into some examples of what I mean by open data. So the Insight to Impact organization based out of South Africa is one where they have a data portal that they've actually taken the CGAP Smallholder Farmer Diaries as well as other national survey data, and they're actually helping visualize this data in a different way. So this is just one example of how what was collected for one research project can be leveraged and used in a different way when it's combined with other data. The Smallholder Finance Product Explorer is one that recently launched, which is a partnership between Mixed Market, One Acre Fund, and RAF Learning Lab, where they are working to create a data framework that helps categorize a diverse set of smallholder finance products in a way that should allow for comparison and benchmarking of financial products. So this is another one where they're inviting, more organizations that have some sort of smallholder finance to share their data in a transparent way so that it helps with the development of new products and services. And then the Global Open Data for Agricultural Nutrition, or GODAN, is an initiative that's been around for a few years, but they're really working to build high-level support among governments, policymakers, international organizations, and business to make their data open, make it available. And so there's a beta version of the Agriculture Open Data Package that's been launched to help governments provide them with a roadmap of how to publish their own data as open data. So the one I want to spend a little bit more time on is actually the CGIAR big data platform. So CGIAR, as you know, is a network membership organization of multiple research organizations around the world. I think there's about 12 member organizations, and they do research anything from plant science, livestock science, etc. So the big data platform in agriculture has 5 communities of practice, and they are actually trying to do some of this standardization and interoperability of data. So they've got a working group on ontologies, socioeconomic data, geospatial data, crop modeling, and then data-driven community of practice, which is actually developing big data tools for use by people within the sector. And so I think these are some really interesting communities of practice that if you were really aiming to make your own data interoperable, there will be some important learnings come from these working groups. And CGIAR also has their own data harvester. And so one of the things that was really interesting from the discussion with them is that, CGIAR could collect almost 200,000 surveys at any given point. And so that's a lot of data that different researchers can use at any given point. And their hope is that that more researchers will use this data to create new value. And so I have a quote here that I just thought was important because of what it kind of demonstrates what CGIAR is aiming for. And the first one is, they say the big data in agricultural platform is where information becomes power to predict, prescribe, produce more food more sustainably. It democratizes decades of agricultural data with the hope that researchers, analysts, et cetera, will mine information for trends, quirks, and develop rapid and accurate, compelling recommendations for farmers, researchers, and policymakers. And the reason why I share this is because in the paper, we actually chose to use CGIAR's big data definition, because there's lots of definitions actually out there, and most people envision big data sets, satellite data, so many data points you can't even imagine, sort of thing. But really, CGIAR's point is that even small data can be big data if you're combining it with different data sources and creating new value. And so I think that's an important message for many service providers, because to one end you may think, well, we'll never have big data because we're a small organization, but the idea is that you can even use your own data in innovative ways, especially when combining it with different data sources. So within the conversation about open information in particular are two main concerns. The first one is interoperability, that you have to find a way to get some level of standardization. It may not necessarily mean indicators, but it may mean more of how you map data so that other researchers can actually use it. And so I think CGIAR is really working in that direction to come up with methods and processes for making data more interoperable. And then probably one that's of most concern is really this consumer protection in privacy. Once data is made available and shared, especially in these shared platforms, how do we protect consumers? And I think with all of the news on Facebook and things like that of lately, everybody can relate to why this is important. But I think there's an agreement from everybody working in this sector is that you shouldn't stop trying to innovate to get the consumer protection right first, but these streams need to be worked on at the same time. So how is data used? So here's an example where I want to basically share the key finding from this is that we're using data in much the same way. It's just technology is changing how we do that. So for example, we're still using data to understand the needs of farmers, to provide them services and try to create that ecosystem that allows farmers to get information when they need it, get financial services to help fund and invest in their farms, to be able to link them to markets, as well as to provide them the inputs and supplies that they need to be productive. And so those things really haven't changed so much as how those are happening. But with this graphic, this is a project that Grameen Foundation had in the Philippines called FarmerLink. And here I found this graphic to be a useful way to think about how, you know, the profiled coconut farmer is in the center of this interaction, where data is coming into the shared data platform. There's an extension agent that's actually collecting data on a mobile phone on behalf of the farmer, and he's providing support back to the farmer, like he's tracking their good agricultural practices, they're developing a farm management plan. And this platform is actually, this data is actually also being used by financial service providers as well as different market actors, where the more farmers that get certification because they are adhering to good agricultural practices, it makes them more attractive to different buyers in the field. They also get early like alert system information on weather events and pest events directly to their phone. And this is a shared platform that the Philippine Coconut Authority, Franklin Baker, which is the agribusiness, and the People's Bank of Caraga are all able to use at the same time, with Grameen helping facilitate kind of as a network orchestrator for these activities. But one of the important learnings that comes from really thinking about how data is used is really about this idea that we really have to not just treat data as a resource, but as an asset, because data is giving rise to new business models. And like Recult is an example of this, where it's almost, they could be looked at as an agri-tech company, a tech startup, an agribusiness, et cetera, but they're really using technology to orchestrate the information and services that farmers need. And one of the, not too long ago, there was a study about just the sustainability of ICT for ag products. And one of the results that came out of that is that those that are showing the most sustainability are actually finding ways to diversify their income streams. And I think we start to see this. So in this graphic, I hope this can help just kind of summarize a little bit of these points. And then on the left-hand side of the graphic, you have your NGOs and governments, actors in the field, where the farmer is at the center of this, and they are providing data out to your TA providers, your research firms, your governments, your NGO, ag extension services in exchange for services. And there may be data being shared depending on partnerships that exist across some of these actors. And on the right-hand side, we have your more commercial actors like your B2B providers like Aware, who provide satellite and alert systems, and then your B2C aggregator. So this B2C aggregator is actually a company that is using technology to pull in or develop an ecosystem that fully supports the farmer. And so I think Recult's just a really good example of this, as I gave an earlier example, because they're bringing in the financial services, they're linking the farmer to those agribusinesses, and they're also providing information services. And so the farmer, in a sense, is paying for some of these services, especially through some of the provision of credit in exchange for the services back. And then there's also exchange of money between some of these different actors. So for example, a B2C aggregator may be collecting data on farmers over a period of time and able to sell that data to, let's say, fertilizer companies so that they can market directly to the farmers. And so some of the examples of the companies that we spoke to were using this sort of relationship where they're collecting data on farmers, but they're also monetizing that data. So when we get to the question, what is innovation in smallholder farmer profile data? We really found that there's no one single pathway to sophisticated use of farmer profile data. So down below in the graphic, if you could imagine a data wheel, kind of the old-fashioned data wheel that maybe helps estimate body mass index, for example, and that each of these circles could spin by themselves and line up in different combinations, then that would determine whether what an organization was doing was really innovative or not. So at one extreme, what might not be particularly innovative would be kind of the traditional collection of data for a research project, where maybe a research firm collects the data on paper surveys, develops a report, gives it back to the service provider, and then that data really sits in that final paper report and never goes beyond that interaction. To another extreme, which would be like the CGIAR big data platform, where all of that data becomes publicly available for use by other researchers, by other B2C, B2B actors that can leverage that data for new insights. So what we really want to convey here is that any one organization can kind of move themselves into a direction of being more innovative depending on the combination that they take. Whether it's finding a way to make your data open, finding a way to use different types of data, capture information, etc. And then finally, within this discussion of, well, what should you do? We utilized a Gartner hype cycle. And so Gartner is a research and technology corporation who's had this hype cycle out there to really help companies consider emerging technologies and assess whether one should make an early move, take a moderate approach, or wait for further maturation of technologies and their use cases. So we mapped out a lot of the either the technology sources or kind of processes onto this hype cycle. So really as a starting point for discussion, because this is more of our perception of, once we pulled all this together, where did we feel some of these were placed? And so on the left-hand side would be those that are a little bit riskier and newer. There's a lot of hype about them, but not a lot of use cases yet. And so these within this category would be things like blockchain and your cryptocurrencies, your cognitive and prescriptive analytics, your shared and open data platforms, drones, et cetera. And on the other extreme, in your plateau of productivity, is really where this is mainstream. Most people are already doing this, and this would be collecting things like your KYC information, your good agricultural practices, land ownership, use of descriptive and diagnostic analytics. What I want to point out here, which I thought was interesting in our discussions, even with some US-based researchers, is that a lot of these technologies are still new, even in industrialized countries like the United States. So I think it's important to understand that there's still a lot of learning going on across agricultural despite the location, just so that everybody, you know, so just so that there's still a perceived risk for a lot of these, even in places where you would assume they would already be well tested. And so I want to, almost wrapping up here, Dan Byrne from the Global Forum of Agricultural Research a few weeks ago gave a very similar presentation about the use of technologies and how we would be using farmer data into the future. And I wanted to end sharing some of the insights he had on kind of going forward. And the first key point that I think is important to mention is that you have to take baby steps, otherwise you'll feel overwhelmed. We've covered a lot in this presentation, and I think this point should be well taken, is that you shouldn't try to do all of this at once. Really start with the end in mind. What is it you're trying to achieve and trying to help farmers improve? Pick a goal, identify some easy wins. You can quickly get overwhelmed. Be patient. It may take a few years to see the full value of your efforts. Get agreement on what data you will provide and how it will be used. And I think this is really going back to that important point of consumer protection and how you share data across different actors, maybe in a partnership or collaboration. And then make sure you have support and learn from others. I hope what you gain out of this presentation are really some of these use cases that just inspire you to think about how the world could look different for you if you took another look at your farmer profile data and thought, you know, how could you make the use of it more innovative. So in conclusion, big data is really what I think is being perceived as the way for bringing fragmented data, resources, and service providers together for supporting a farmer's ecosystem. And again, when we use big data here, we're talking about using data in a way and leveraging that data for new insights. We really have an opportunity to help farmers make decisions in crucial moments. So when we aggregate data like remote sensing data, satellite, and weather, we can really help them make decisions in the moment that they need to happen. It doesn't have to wait for an interaction with an extension agent, for example, for them to be able to act on something. And there's really no better time than now to strengthen the farmer ecosystems, because these advances in technology really facilitate our ability to know what farmer data we do and do not have. We can marry plant and animal science with human science. And I think this is a really important point that we pull out in the paper, but I haven't been able to spend too much time here, is that what's really cool about, I think, the analytics and the use of big data is that you can actually take that plant science data that's being collected, you know, by a bunch of your CGIAR entities, for example, and combine it with what the behaviors that the farmer has, so that you can come up with the best combination for what that farmer should do with what he has in terms of the plants that he has. And then you can fully link this farmer with the ecosystem. So for example, with that example on Recult, again, just showing how you can coordinate those activities with the financial services, the market players, et cetera. And then you can really be precise with information and financial decisions. You can really help farmers, kind of going back to this point about crucial moments, help them make decisions in the moment that they need to, because the data is all there to help them do that. But finally, one last caveat is that despite the growth of this digital economy, person-to-person support will continue to be necessary, because I think across the board there is continued acknowledgement that there's a trust deficit, and especially with technology, you have to build that trust so that they can learn to trust things that may come to them in a digital format. So the next steps is that, as Ellen had indicated early on, the report and the 2-pager will be published soon and shared with everyone. And as a part of that publication, there are some key considerations for service providers that are in that paper. And so what we did really is, as we were going through, we were thinking about, for an organization like our own, for Grameen Foundation, what types of questions should we be asking at each of these stages? So what questions should we ask about how do we define the smallholder, all the way to how should we be sharing data, whether it should be open, continue to be private, et cetera. So I hope that those questions you'll find helpful when the paper becomes available. So I want to thank you for your time and your patience. I know it's been a long presentation, but I hope it's given you some new ideas and some new questions to ponder for your own organization. So I will stop right there, and Ellen, see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Bobby, so much. That was a great presentation. And yes, we do have a number of questions that we will address during this remaining period of time. So the first question is from Yasmin from CGAP, and she was asking you to talk more about the challenges of applying a gender lens to such work and why it is important to have a gender lens in such type of work.
Sure. So I think across the board that a lot of service providers acknowledge that there is maybe less representation of women within their own farmer groups. And that may just be because of the context, that they live in, that women aren't perceived as farmers at all, or even the decision makers. But I think what's really interesting, well, I think there are certain organizations that take a very focused a gender focus. And so they're intentionally trying to figure out how to how to work through some different contextual social norms, et cetera. And then others, I think, are still, when they work through cooperatives or these existing groups, it makes it difficult to reach women if they're not already part of those groups. So I think the key message that comes out on this is that you really have to be intentional. Like if you want to reach women, but you want to reach women in a way that helps them versus just adding to their time use burden or work, their chores, et cetera, that you kind of have to take a very thoughtful approach to this. But what I found really interesting through a lot of this research is just how technology may be able to facilitate more of our understanding of the roles that women play, even just by changing a definition to looking at plot manager versus, head of household, or the person who self-identifies as a farmer, is one step in that direction. But in the paper, there's one example where some of the research is showing how satellite can actually predict some of the barriers that women may face just by, acknowledging different lack of water sources, et cetera. And there's one project that is part of one of these CGIAR innovation grants, where one organization is actually going to use Fitbits to be able to estimate time use in agriculture for women. So I think there's as much opportunity to in innovations to address, the gender gap that we see here. But I think, again, it's just going to have to be very intentional going forward. So hopefully that answers your question. But but we do, Yasmin, there is several pages that we use to address gender because we thought it was an important aspect of the paper that needed to be pulled out.
And you will see the report once it's published. We will make sure to send it out to the attendees who attended this webinar. And it will be also live on USAID website. More information will be coming about it soon, we hope. And the second question is from Joseph, and he was asking about the middlemen or traders, because he says, how about the middlemen or traders? I suppose they gather information about farmers, not digitized though.
Is the question about what is their role?
Yes, I assume so.
I'll try to answer this, and I invite others who may have a better answer than me on this. I mean, I think part of it is being able to map out where they fit into this. In some places, what I understand is that the traders themselves can become they can collect some of the data. I mean, and I don't know if this is accurate, so I will invite anyone from my Grameen team in particular who is part of the agrotech, but I think even some of those traders or the small businesses in the area actually have become more of those types of actors where they're collecting the data and providing, information resources back, and they're helping coordinate some of those activities. So I think there is a role for them. It probably is more about who is already collecting the data that they can leverage and how do they, feed into that process. But I invite, if anybody else has a better answer to that, I mean, I am definitely not really an agricultural expert here. So I invite anybody else who has a better answer to that too.
Okay, thank you. And the following questions are related to sustainability of using such technologies. Scott is asking in more details. In case of an SHF ID profile blockchain, how can donor-funded projects that include such technologies sustain the chain after the project is over? Is it incumbent, for example, upon the host government to assume responsibility for sustaining the blockchain afterwards? And Meryl also had a similar question about sustainability, where he was asking, would you be able to share more information on the sustainability piece that was just mentioned as related to ICT?
Mm-hmm. I think our impression at this point is that, with the graphic, and I'll just go back and show it because I think this is where we were talking about it, is that the donors, investors that are providing, funds for either startup or testing and helping pilot some of these things are still, number one, they're still needed for pushing on some innovations, but they're also still needed for continued support until some of these models, I think, actually get proven. I think that while the expectation is over time, especially for anybody on this kind of commercial side of the equation, that, over time, this investment will go down because they'll start to show profitability, et cetera. I don't think that that's 100% the case yet. Like even some of these that have a fairly complicated kind of business model where they've got income streams coming in different directions, that they're still relying on some investment, even on a lot of even on, the points about blockchain, et cetera. So I don't think at the moment that any one of these are 100% proven. I think they're still kind of in that testing period, and maybe time will tell, like how many of them are still around operating in the same way that they are today. But I think what, we found from the ones that we did interview is that they're not relying on just, they're not just relying on the farmer to pay. The farmer's paying maybe something, but they're not covering, the actual costs. And so I think, the financial services that are underpinning some of these help kind of cross-subsidize some of the costs that they have from some of the other services. I don't know if that adequately addressed the question, but.
Okay, thank you. And then there's a question about the type of farmers that was interviewed. Daniel is asking, the example of farmers doing planting is a great example, but it seems to have been in a location of relatively affluent farmers that the typical 50 future farmer, rather than the typical 50 future farmer. Do we see poorer and smaller farmers listening to similar advice, let's say in Senegal?
Ellen, if I understand the question in terms of like maybe the poverty levels of the smallholder farmers, is that kind of what the question's getting at?
Yes, and how the poorer and smaller farmers listen to the similar advice, like for example in Senegal context.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the FAO, the use of their applications, they're testing those out in Senegal. But I think what is important across the board, regardless of country, is just this continued importance of having a person-to-person interaction. That the technology has to prove itself over time, but that person-to-person interaction is still important. And so I only think in contexts where mobile phone usage is higher, where people will trust that data more, even down to maybe poor farmers who don't have access to smartphones, and who will receive, their support actually from they'll continue to receive support from the extension agent that's working with them. And the extension agent is the one who's enabled with the technology to help them perform their job better and perhaps even reach more people, because that technology, helps them be more responsive and providing timely feedback. So we really didn't get so much into segmenting the market of the different organizations that we worked for. I mean, I think most of them would indicate that they probably reach a a fairly, I'm not going to say a wide range, but they reach anywhere from, very poor to poor farmers within the population that they serve. And really, we didn't get so much into, the impact of these services, because I think that could actually take its own landscape or literature review assessment just to pull all of this data together and ask the question on both the poverty outreach as well as the impact that it has on them. So I would just say that I think in places where the phone penetration isn't that great, especially among very poor farmers, is that you see more of extension agents or people who are enabled with the digital technology to help support them.
And related to that, there's a note from Nicole saying that considering Sierra Leone, with 70% of the population engaged in agriculture or agriculture-related activities, have high prevalence of illiterate farmers, I think the use of these technologies is impossible. So what do you think, Bobby, about that?
I agree. I mean, I know that, Grameen Foundation works in places like Burkina Faso where, we've had lots of discussions about the fact that it's going to be a while before digital technology is actually in the hands of the farmers themselves. But what you can do is enable, let's say, self-help group members, to be a representative for that group, or the community, the savings group facilitators with the technology to support the group. I mean, in a lot of those cases, the use of video, the use of IVR becomes really important as a means for sharing information. So I think you just see adaptations for places like that where, number one, the infrastructure is not there yet to make this a very viable business for sure. I mean, I think there's still a lot of work that has to happen, to where you support those farmers in a very different way, but it doesn't mean you can't use the technology. You just have to find a different way to make it feasible. And so even in Burkina, for example, where we've worked with savings groups, for a long time, like we have the facilitator actually shows videos on her own phone to the group. So there are adaptations that you just have to use in those types of contexts.
Okay. The next question is about how do you measure the accuracy and or confidence bounds for predictive applications of these kinds of data?
Okay, ask that question again.
How do you measure the accuracy and or confidence bounds for predictive applications of these kinds of data?
Well, if there is anybody on this call that can answer that question better than me, then I will invite them. I mean, I will tell you from a personal reflection on this is that there is a whole world of data science out there that I can only begin to comprehend. I've been doing research for, quite a while, but I definitely would say that, the people and the data analysts working in this space really are, on the cutting edge. And there's actually I've just seen lately even more universities, supporting data science degrees, because this is becoming more and more of a skill set. So to be honest, I can't answer that question because I don't have enough of a background to answer it. But if there is somebody on the phone call who, they're comfortable with the question, then I would definitely invite them to answer it.
Okay, let's see if anybody has more information on that.
Okay, sorry, that's just a little bit out of balance for me. I'll be making up an answer that won't be very fair.
Okay, no problem. And moving forward, what are your thoughts on how do you see blockchain helping farmers to add value for their farm data so that the data gains some intellectual property and can be monetized by the farmers?
Yes, I mean, I think this is, something that came up when we were talking about blockchain, is that, the hope and kind of the promise of blockchain is that one day a farmer would be able to basically own their own data through the use of blockchain and be able to charge for different organizations to access it. I don't think that's actually happening right now. So it's kind of a hope and an expectation, that will happen. But I know that blockchain is being used, especially for, keeping track of some of the transactions for some of the, companies that we spoke to. But, again, to be honest, blockchain is one of those concepts that even for me, it's taken a while to wrap my head around how it works. And so I think we're just going to also need to see more use cases of, how it works and who can use it and how they can use it, et cetera, going forward. But if there's somebody on the call that, has a lot of background in blockchain, I definitely invite them to speak more about that too.
Yes, I kind of agree that we are still to see how blockchain can bring value to the international development or agriculture also. Mm-hmm. Connected to the farmers' rights, can you please talk more about farmers' rights to the data and how to preserve their rights and interests?
Yeah, I think this is a big question mark at the moment. I mean, I think even in our own reflections on how much of us actually own our own data, even, in the United States, Europe, et cetera. I mean, to be able to create an expectation that someday a farmer would, be able to protect the rights to their own data is a big question mark, because I don't think we see that actually working in just the world in general. I mean, if you just take the conversation going on about, Facebook right now and who, did they actually understand the privacy that they were giving up by, signing into different third-party applications and things like that. So I mean, to be honest, I think this is something that, the sector is really going to have to tackle because it's not even working that well. I mean, I think across the board for any of us. So I think it's a big hope and an expectation. And I think those who are actually, like at GoDan and some of the actors like that are actually trying to tackle consumer protection and privacy, because open data in particular has to deal with this, then I think we'll just kind of have to watch for some examples on that.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is, what difference are you seeing for data needs and use for different types of smallholder farmers, for example, SHF in high-value cash crops and farmers involved in more substance and local stable crop production?
Mm-hmm. To be honest, I mean, from my perspective, I think a lot of the technologies that are out there can actually help both types. It's just going to require some adaptation. So for example, thinking about some of the work that the MNOs are doing with GSMA, targeting people just for even small crop gardening information, providing information resources, for example, is one step for that, compared to some of those that maybe have more of the higher tech collaborations where you're linking a bunch of different actors together using applications and things like that. So I think it's possible that you could do it at both levels. It just requires adaptations, and I think we do need more examples of where, going back to Yasmin's question earlier about gender and women, is we need more use cases of how some of these things work at different levels. Because my perception is not that every example, for example, that we have in this is that they're all, cash crop initiatives, for example, because there are some that focus more on horticulture and crops like that. So I don't think that's a great answer, but it's just to say, I think my perception is that a lot of these things can be used for whatever level you're working at. You're just going to have to be very smart about how you adapt them to the context.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Are complex technology and costs likely to be prohibitive, or can there be quick wins that can be attempted with low complexity and costs?
I think that's a great question, because I know that, as we've thought about this, even, from our own perspective, what would be some of those easy wins? And, to be honest, I don't know how expensive some of these technologies are, because we really didn't get into costing them so much, but I think it's a great question so that you can understand, what sort of investment, you're trying to make. So I mean, to be honest, I really don't know how to answer the question, except for I think we have that same one, for ourselves, is like, what could you do, with a small amount of money compared to a larger one. Yeah, so I don't have a great answer for that one, to be honest, but I think it is a very important and a good question to just understand what the costs are for any one of these, because I know, when I thought about it, thinking, you really need a data science person at every organization to help you think through how to take your own data to a new level, because, for many of us, it's not our background to know how these things work, like what types of technologies you actually need to be able to make a lot of the back end of this work.
Thank you. The next question is about impact investors. For impact investors who reach the smallholder farmers to the farm-based organizations, in which case the impact investors have direct interaction with the farmers, how can this fintech data collection be relevant to the impact investors?
Okay, Ellen, could you just ask that question again?
Yeah. So for impact investors who reach the smallholder farmers through the farm-based organizations, in which case the impact investors have direct interaction with the farmers, how can this fintech data collection be relevant to the impact investors?
I don't know if this is going to be the right answer to this question, but I think, one of the things that came out in, the research that we did on this is that anybody investing in this space definitely needs to have, I guess, what they call patient capital, in that, a lot of this technology has been around for a while, and not necessarily in agriculture, because agriculture is kind of at the bottom of digitalization. But one of the caveats that's been mentioned about agriculture is that contexts are so different that, people are going to have to, there's a risk of becoming frustrated that changes aren't that fast, because there's a lot of variables within agriculture that everyone needs to be aware of. You've got climate change issues, you've got, farmer behaviors, you've got land, you've got plant science, you've got animal science. Like, there is a lot going on. So the pathways aren't like crystal clear. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but it just reminds me of the fact that anybody, both from the investor, donor, government investing side of this, is that, a lot of this is going to take some patience, as well as, to let some of these things play out and learn and adapt, because of the fact that there's so much going on within agriculture that the results aren't going to be like obvious for quite a while. So I don't know if that answers it. And if you don't think I touched on it, if you can rephrase the question, then maybe I can answer it better.
Okay. Bobby, what about the constraints for collecting data through digital mode? How far the mobile infrastructure will be a burden in collecting data through mobile technology in developing or underdeveloping countries?
Mm-hmm. So I do think that while we focused on, digital data collection, kind of as a starting point, that there is still a lot of paper survey work. I mean, and to be honest, even within Grameen Foundation, depending on, the funding that we have to move data collection over to a digital, platform is still a constraint. And I know that we heard this from a lot of different service providers who are still using, paper surveys, that they just don't have the funding or financing to invest in the infrastructure, even though it's getting cheaper over time. So just the fact that you really do need, smartphones to make this easier and quicker. Otherwise, it takes just as much time. But I from somebody who has been collecting paper surveys for a really long time, and just more recently with Grameen, seeing how the data is being collected digitally. I mean, I do think that the more investment that we can make in helping move people over to digital, just for the mere fact that it's less frustrating, it takes less time, because people really get stuck at that data entry point. Because I've got multiple cases where we've collected, certain of our partners have collected data in the surveys, and then it sits there for months on end until somebody can enter it. And then by the time it gets, analyzed and put together, you're 6 months to 8 months behind in being able to provide value, from that data. So I think, that's just one aspect of it. I mean, obviously, even, you know, in some countries where the mobile infrastructure just still is growing, you know, digital data collection is a novelty. I mean, Burkina Faso, where we work, is just one example of that, you know, there's still a lot of paper surveying going on, but if there's not, you know, the funding has been there to move over to the, you know, the investment. So I think, you know, my hope is that, you know, I even look at places like Latin America where you would assume, because the economies are a little bit more advanced, that there would be more digital data collection, but actually compared to Africa, like we found very few examples in Latin America of digital data collection, especially within the agricultural space. So I think even in economies where people assume it should already happen, you know, less investment has happened there. So it's actually happening less than I think in some of the examples that we had from Asia and Africa, for example.
And as we have like just a couple minutes left, I want to ask
Sure.
last question. Yes, ICT is good, and we all want to move forward with using the data technology to gather data, but do you think, or is there any examples of ICT having a negative effect on smallholder farmers of once we're using ICT for gathering data or any other way?
I will say I'm sure that there are, and I don't think we uncovered, you know, many of the negative ones, except for, you know, just examples of the challenges of getting the ICT for ag tools to work within certain contexts. So just, you know, one of the interviews that we had just even noted that, and this is more on the data collection side of things, that even when you assume a cell phone's going to pick up a GPS, you know, coordinate that's supposed to be relevant for a farm, you know, the company shared with us that the GPS points were mapping back to China where the phones were built. So there's a lot of like infrastructure and like technology challenges that I definitely think, you know, come into a lot of these, and a lot of testing a lot of this out. And so I'm really not an ICT for ag expert, especially on the technology side, but I would just, I think I'd go back to that same point about the patience and, you know, the amount of learning that has to go on with any one of these to get them to work. And that's where I think that point about, you know, person-to-person interaction is still going to be really critical, you know, even in places where you are testing out the technology tools, because there, you know, you still have to kind of ground truth whether some of these things are working well or not.
With this note, I will say thank you everybody for submitting your questions to us, and I apologize for those whose questions we were not able to address in this webinar today. However, please stay tuned. We will be sharing the report and the two-pager as soon as they're publicly available for and upload on our websites. We'll also be sharing the recorded webinar to all attendees who registered for this webinar today. And Bobby, if you have any closing remarks, please feel free to share.
Sure. No, I'll just say thank you to everyone who participated today, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue and seeing more advances in this area. So thank you. And thank you again to my Grameen team who helped support the research on this. And to Kwesi and Ellen for their support. Thank you.
With this note, thank you to the Grameen Foundation and Bobby for putting this webinar together. And thank you for Kwesi for supporting us during this process of providing feedback and comments on the report, as well as the presentation and the two-pager. I wish you all to have a nice week and nice day. And thank you again for attending this webinar and being with us today in the morning.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.